It was February 1933, and the First National Bank of Clay County, Nebraska was no more than a red silhouette against the frozen dark. The roof had already caved in, spilling sparks into the snow. A dozen men stood in silence along the dirt road, faces hidden beneath wool caps, eyes reflecting the fire. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They just watched the paper burn. Deeds, ledgers, notes. The very evidence of their ruin curling to ash. One old farmer broke the silence. "We weren't thieves," he said softly. "We were starving." When the sheriff arrived hours later, the fire had burned clean. No footprints but their own. No money taken, no lives lost. Just a bank erased from the map. By morning, word had spread like dry grass catching flame. Across Kansas, Iowa, South Dakota, more banks went up. And within weeks, the FBI was chasing something it had never seen before: an organized rebellion of American farmers. J. Edgar Hoover's men had dealt with gangsters, Dillinger, Capone, the Barker Karpus boys, but not with this. These weren't criminals hiding behind guns. They were men who once fed the nation, now hunted for burning its paper heart. Washington was stunned. The Bureau's first report spoke of agrarian terrorism. Agents counted more than 5,000 farmers under suspicion. Dozens already jailed, hundreds of incidents unreported. But behind each name there was the same story: drought, debt, foreclosure. The Great Plains had become a battlefield without uniforms. Families sleeping in barns that used to be theirs. Children going to school barefoot because the shoes had been pawned. And somewhere between hunger and justice, the line blurred until fire felt like the only way to be heard. At sunrise, the ashes of the Clay County Bank still smoked. The wind pushed them east, carrying the smell of rebellion toward Washington, D.C. The Bureau had no idea what kind of storm it was about to walk into. As the firelight fades, the camera pulls back across the plains, to the drought, the dust, and the slow death of the land that started it all. By 1931, the heartland had turned the color of bone. Pale, cracked, and waiting for rain that never came. Across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, the soil itself seemed to give up. You could hear it in the silence between fence posts, in the way cattle looked toward empty wells. The market crash of '29 had already crippled the banks. Now the land was finishing the job. Cornfields lay flat, unharvested, prices collapsing from $1 a bushel to less than 10 cents. A man could sell his entire crop and still owe money. The newspapers called it a temporary downturn. But out here, men stopped calling it anything at all. John Leland, a farmer outside Des Moines, wrote in his journal, "The day they took the land, the wind stopped blowing." He wasn't speaking of weather, he meant the breath of life itself. Banks began foreclosing by the hundreds. Farm auctions became grim rituals. Families standing in the cold, watching their livestock, tools, and furniture sold to strangers. Sometimes the neighbors came, not to buy, but to resist. They called it a penny auction. A horse worth $50 sold for a nickel, a tractor for a dime. Then once the sheriff's back was turned, they'd quietly return it to the farmer who'd lost it. It wasn't law, it was mercy. And it couldn't last. By 1932, nearly 1 in every 4 farms in Iowa faced foreclosure. Families packed what they could into Model A trucks, heading west until the dust caught them again. Children coughed black mud. Mothers tore dresses into rags for masks. Radio towers hummed with the voice of despair. "The Lord will provide," said the pastors. But the Lord was late, and the banks came early. For the first time in generations, the land, that sacred inheritance passed from father to son, belonged to someone else. Corporations, insurance companies, men in offices far from the fields. The moral compass of the nation began to spin. What did it mean to be honest when honesty led to hunger? What did it mean to obey the law when the law served only the lender? By winter, desperation had spread like frost. Farmhands began carrying shotguns to courthouse steps. Towns whispered of rebellion. In Sioux County, a notice was nailed to the sheriff's door. "We will no longer be evicted by the stroke of a pen. If you come for our farms, bring a bucket, because the fire will be waiting." The handwriting was steady, deliberate. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. In Washington, the numbers were written in neat ink on government ledgers. In the heartland, they were carved into hunger and pride. The day the land went silent, America stopped being one country. There was the America of paper, banks, courts, and signatures. And there was the America of soil, men, families, and faith. Between them lay a widening fault line, one spark away from open war. And that spark was already on its way, hidden in the pocket of a farmer named Milo Reno, a man who believed that hunger was reason enough to fight. As the dust rolls over the plains, a convoy of tractors heads toward Des Moines, banners flapping in the wind, 3 words painted in red: "We're on strike." The morning they rolled into Des Moines, the earth itself seemed to move. Hundreds of tractors, wagons, and Model A trucks thundered down Highway 6, their engines coughing black smoke against the winter sky. Farmers from every corner of Iowa, Boone, Story, Cherokee, came in convoys that stretched for miles. They weren't there to sell or to beg. They came to stop the system that was starving them. In the lead truck stood Milo Reno, a man with gray eyes and the posture of a preacher. Once a farmer, now a voice for the desperate, Reno carried no weapon, only a bullhorn and a Bible worn thin from years in his coat pocket. He raised it to his lips and shouted above the engines, "If we can't sell our crops for what they're worth, then we sell nothing. Let the nation feel what it's like to go hungry." That was August of 1932, the birth of the Farmers' Holiday Association. They called it a strike of hunger, a last stand against the banks, the railroads and the grain companies that bought low and sold high while the farmers drowned in debt. Their slogan was simple, angry and true: "We can't eat credit." By week's end, highways were blocked. Milk trucks were turned around at gunpoint. Livestock trains sat rusting on the rails. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder, guarding intersections with pitchforks and shotguns, refusing to let food leave the county until prices rose. The government called them agitators. The newspapers called them radicals. But most Americans, especially those who'd watched their own savings vanish in 1929, understood. One reporter from the Chicago Tribune wrote, "It is not anarchy that drives them, it is hunger in a land of plenty." In western Iowa, sheriffs tried to break the strikes. Deputies tore down barricades, confiscated wagons, arrested men for interference with commerce. Yet each time the farmers rebuilt, stronger, angrier. In one small town near Lamar's, a sheriff arrived to serve an eviction notice. He was met by 300 farmers on horseback, faces covered in bandanas, tools in hand. They surrounded him quietly, then disarmed his deputies. No one was hurt. The sheriff was escorted to his car, told to go home before supper. That night, the local courthouse mysteriously lost power. When the lights came back, every foreclosure file had vanished. The message was clear. The law no longer ruled here, hunger did. Milo Reno traveled from town to town, speaking from the flatbeds of trucks, his voice cracking through cheap amplifiers. "Brothers, if we can feed the world, we can save ourselves. We are the foundation, not the debt." His words echoed across barns, meeting halls, and frozen fields. The movement grew faster than anyone could count. Within months, farmers' holiday chapters appeared in Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas. Even the Dakotas joined in. But where hope gathered, fear followed. Bankers began hiring armed guards. Insurance men carried revolvers under their coats. County sheriffs rode with rifles across their laps. And from Washington, the FBI started to take notes. At first, Hoover's men thought this was a passing protest, another dust storm of anger that would settle. But then came Sioux City, March 9th. A foreclosure sale for a farmer named John Mock was set to begin. The courthouse steps were already crowded when the sheriff arrived. Within minutes, the crowd surged. Someone threw a brick through a bank window. Someone else set fire to the auctioneer's car. When the smoke cleared, the sheriff's ledger was gone, stolen, burned, or both. No one was killed, but the message hit harder than any bullet. In Washington, Hoover read the field report in silence. His agents wrote, "Crowd of over 500. No central leader. High discipline. Objective appears to be destruction of loan documents. Bank property destroyed. Farmers uncooperative with investigators." Hoover didn't see farmers. He saw an insurgency. He called it the greatest internal threat since the Great War. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Across the Midwest, night fires began to glow. First one, then another. Banks in small towns went up like matchboxes. Sometimes a single man was seen walking away, sometimes 100. By the time the ashes cooled, the records were gone, the debt erased. When asked later why they did it, one farmer said simply, "We burned the paper, not the people." But the Bureau didn't see mercy, it saw arson. In a country trembling from the Great Depression, every spark now looked like a revolution. The movement that began with hunger was about to meet the full weight of the federal government. And in the quiet between those fires, the plains held their breath. Because no one knew who would blink first, the farmers or the FBI. The tractors that had once carried banners now rolled under cover of darkness. No slogans, no speeches, just the sound of engines fading into the cold wind. The rebellion had entered its second phase, the War of Silence. As dawn breaks over Kansas, smoke rises again, this time from the roof of a bank. Inside, ledgers curl in the flames while the sheriff's siren wails across empty streets. The nation's fields are starving, and the fire has begun to spread. The first embers rose from a wooden bank in Phillips County, Kansas. It was May 1933, and the night smelled of rain and kerosene. No one ever saw who lit the match. Some said it was 3 men from town, others swore it was the banker himself, desperate for an insurance claim. But by sunrise, the vault stood black and empty, the records gone, the mortgages ash. That was the beginning. Within 6 months, more than 30 rural banks across the Midwest went up in flames. Some burned clean, others only scorched, but all left the same mark, a single sheet of paper nailed to the charred doorframe. Debt canceled by the people. The fires moved like whispers across Iowa, the Dakotas, Nebraska. No organization, no clear leaders, just hunger that had found its language. Every burned ledger meant one less family evicted, one more acre saved. But to the FBI, it was something else entirely. In Washington, Hoover's office buzzed day and night. Reports flooded in. Bank torched near Redfield. Suspects fled in farm truck. License unknown. Local sheriff refuses to cooperate. The Bureau had handled kidnappings, robberies, even political bombings. But this was different. The men they were chasing wore overalls, not masks. They weren't stealing money. They were destroying proof of it. Hoover's agents arrived in plain clothes, carrying notebooks and the authority of the federal seal. They sat in diners, asked questions, took names. But the farmers had already closed ranks. In small towns from Wichita to Sioux Falls, the moment a stranger asked too much, conversation died. The waitress stopped pouring coffee. A hand would touch the brim of a hat, and the agent, feeling the air grow thick around him, would quietly leave. They called it the Code of the Hungry. No one talked, no one confessed, and every week another bank went dark. One night in Nebraska, a young bureau agent named Henry Lusk followed tire tracks from a burned bank into a cornfield. There, half buried in mud, he found a metal box filled with half-burned deeds. He carried them back to the sheriff's office, proud of the find. The sheriff looked at him, sighed, and said, "Son, those papers were all that was left keeping 50 families in debt. You didn't just find evidence, you found enemies." The next day, Agent Lusk requested a transfer back east. By the fall of 1933, the situation had reached the president's desk. Roosevelt, barely months into office, read the FBI's reports and frowned. "They're not anarchists," he said. "They're farmers, and they're burning banks because the banks are burning them." Behind those walls of the White House, a moral war played out. Hoover wanted arrests. Roosevelt wanted understanding. America needed both. Meanwhile, on the ground, the rebellion only grew more deliberate. In Sioux City, a man named Frank Heenan led a group of 50 farmers into a local bank at midnight. They carried buckets of gasoline, hammers, and one old hymn book. Before lighting the fire, Heenan opened the book and read aloud, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors." When the flames rose, the men stood outside in a circle, hats in hand, watching in silence as the walls folded inward. No cheering, no laughter, only the sound of burning paper and the faint hum of cicadas. They didn't see themselves as outlaws. They believed they were burning lies, the ledgers that had turned labor into bondage. For years, America had treated credit as salvation. Now the farmers were declaring it sin. Still, fire is a language no government can ignore. By winter, Hoover had labeled the movement agrarian terrorism. The Bureau's files grew thick with names, grainy photos, and coded telegrams. The press followed, printing headlines like "Midwest Rebellion Spreads" and "Hoover's Men Hunt Farm Arson Ring." In towns like Hastings and Sioux Falls, the sight of smoke now meant two things. Either another family had been spared, or another life was about to be destroyed. Because for every bank that burned, someone had to pay. And the FBI was about to make sure of it. December 1933, the first major arrest came quietly. Agents surrounded a farmhouse in Iowa, taking 3 men in the dead of night. Neighbors watched from their porches, arms crossed, saying nothing. The next morning, the town awoke to find the sheriff's office boarded shut. No one would testify. The arrests only deepened the silence. The Bureau could imprison a few, but it couldn't imprison an entire way of life. Hoover's men began writing frustrated reports. No cooperation, no witnesses, locals sympathetic to suspects. And in one marginal note, Hoover himself scribbled a single question. If the people protect the guilty, who are the guilty? By the time the last snow fell, the fires had slowed, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The rebellion had reached its limit. And yet, out there in the cold wind, the ashes still glowed faintly, waiting for anyone to listen. In Washington, Roosevelt finally did. He called his advisors to the Oval Office and said, "We will not build prisons for the hungry. We will build credit for the farmer." That order would become the seed of something larger, a change that would shake the balance between banks and people forever. But before that reform could rise, the men who had lit those fires would face the law. And their trials would decide not only their fate, but the nation's. Because when justice meets desperation, the courtroom becomes the front line. The camera follows the smoke drifting into a courthouse window. Inside, 12 jurors take their seats, men who have plowed the same fields, lost the same homes, and now must judge their own. The courthouse in Sioux City was built from limestone, the color of old bones. On a cold morning in January 1934, the steps outside filled with boots, mufflers, and breath that hung white in the air. They came to see the trial of the men accused of burning 3 banks across Iowa and Nebraska, the so-called farm fire ring. Inside, the air smelled of paper and fear. The defendants sat in worn suits, hands folded, faces weathered by sun and soil. They were not strangers here. They were fathers, neighbors, men whose names were still painted on mailboxes at the edge of town. Across from them sat the bureau's finest, dark coats, sharp hats, and eyes that never blinked. Their briefcases carried photographs of charred vaults, ledgers half burned, and the blackened remains of safes cracked by heat. The case was simple on paper. 3 men, Frank Heenan, Earl Morris, Thomas Lyle, charged with arson, conspiracy, and destruction of federal property. But in the pews behind them sat the town, farmers with cracked hands and unpaid bills, women who had watched their husbands' land disappear into debt, children who didn't understand why the men they loved were now called criminals. When the prosecutor stood, his voice carried the chill of Washington. "These men," he said, "chose fire over law. They burned the foundation of this country, its trust in order and property." But when the defense rose, the tone shifted. "Order," he said. "What order leaves a man's children starving? What property belongs to a bank that never plowed an acre?" A murmur rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder. The trial lasted 6 days. 6 days of testimony from agents, sheriffs, and witnesses who saw nothing but smoke. Each time the prosecution spoke of law, the jurors looked down. Each time the defense spoke of hunger, they looked up. One witness, a farmer's widow, took the stand. Her voice trembled but did not break. "They came to take my home," she said. "My husband's grave is in that field. When the bank burned, I thanked God, because for one night I slept without fear." The judge struck the statement from the record. The jury never forgot it. Outside, reporters from the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune sent dispatches titled "The Hungry on Trial" and "Justice on the Plains." Across America, city dwellers who once blamed farmers for falling prices now saw them differently, not as rebels but as survivors. Hoover read those headlines in silence. His bureau had done its job, but something in the nation's heart had shifted. Each verdict that came back not guilty weakened the authority he had built on fear and control. On the 7th day, the jury returned. 12 men, most wearing the same mud on their boots as the accused. The foreman stood, hat in hand. "Your Honor," he said, "we find the defendants not guilty." The room erupted, not with cheers, but with something deeper: relief. It wasn't victory, it was survival. The judge rapped his gavel, but even he looked tired of the sound. The men who had burned banks walked free that afternoon, greeted not by applause but by quiet nods from neighbors who understood what freedom had cost. For Hoover, it was a defeat wrapped in legality. For Roosevelt, it was a signal, a call to act before the nation tore itself apart. That spring, the president signed the Farm Credit Act of 1933 into law. It allowed farmers to refinance their debts at lower rates, protected them from foreclosure, and created a new agency, the Farm Credit Administration, to give the countryside a fighting chance. In barns and co-ops across the plains, word spread fast. Washington blinked, they said. The fires began to fade, replaced by hope, cautious, fragile, but real. The Bureau withdrew its agents one by one. The case files thinned. The investigations ended quietly. And for the first time in 4 years, the smoke over the plains began to clear. But even as peace returned, something in the American spirit had changed. The farmers had proven that desperation could move mountains or burn them down. Justice, they'd learned, wasn't a law written in ink. It was the line between survival and surrender. One reporter captured it best. "The men of the soil have reminded us that hunger has no patience for paperwork." By summer, the fields began to turn green again. The fires that had once consumed banks now fueled tractors. The same men who had been fugitives returned to their plows, hands on the same soil they'd nearly lost. Yet beneath the new crops, the ashes remained, a reminder that mercy had come not from courts but from defiance. The Great Depression was far from over, but the heartland had found a way to breathe again. Still, the question lingered. If the farmers had not burned those banks, would Washington have ever listened? The camera drifts over the courthouse, its doors now open, the crowd dispersing into the wind. The old limestone stands unchanged, but the nation that built it is not the same. And out on the plains, where the wheat has begun to rise again, the last traces of smoke curl into the sky like a memory refusing to die. Because some debts once burned never truly vanish. They linger in conscience, in history, in the quiet between the furrows. As twilight settles over the plains, a single stalk of wheat sways where a bank once stood. The camera pulls back, and the narrator's voice returns, lower now, steadier. They called them criminals. But what if fire was the only justice left? The years rolled on, and the wind across the Great Plains carried fewer ashes. By 1935, the fires were gone, the trials concluded, and the men who once faced prison had returned to their fields. But the land had changed, and so had they. The Great Depression had carved lines into faces that used to smile easily. Hands once rough from harvest now bore the tremor of loss and memory. In every small town from Nebraska to Iowa, people spoke quietly of the fire years, like veterans recalling a war fought without uniforms. The banks rebuilt, cleaner, newer, stronger, steel vaults instead of wood, concrete instead of brick. But their doors stayed open now, and their interest rates fell under the watchful eye of Washington. The farmers had forced the nation to remember something it had almost forgotten, that without those who feed it, a country cannot stand. In Des Moines, a monument was raised to agricultural renewal, a polite phrase that said nothing about the men who once set torch to ledgers under the stars. There were no names carved into it, just a bronze sheaf of wheat, polished by years of wind. And yet, in the quiet corners of diners and grain elevators, the stories lived on. Old men would lean across tables and whisper, "I saw the sky turn red that night. We didn't steal, we just erased what was killing us." Sometimes you gotta burn the paper to save the people. They didn't boast, they remembered. The Farm Credit Act began to work, loans reopened, tractors started again. Sons who once rode west came home to reclaim the ground their fathers had nearly lost. Out of ruin grew cooperation, rural credit unions, co-ops, farmers pooling what little they had to survive together. But under the hum of renewal, the moral question lingered like a low wind through the corn. Had justice been served or merely survived? Because for every family saved, another still vanished into poverty. For every field restored, one more lay fallow beneath dust. And though Washington had softened, the system itself had not changed its nature. It had only learned to fear the flame. J. Edgar Hoover never forgave that lesson. In Bureau archives, the case was filed under rural unrest, contained. Contained, yes, but never erased. When reporters later asked him about the episode, Hoover replied coldly, "Desperation breeds crime, compassion breeds weakness." But out in the fields, men like Milo Reno answered differently. Standing before a crowd in 1936, his voice cracked with age and truth. "We didn't fight for power, we fought for bread. And the only thing hungrier than a man is a system that forgets him." That line drew no applause, just silence, the kind that settles when words hit home. Time passed, the dust storms eased, the country healed enough to forget. By the 1940s, the fires of rebellion were replaced by the fires of war. New uniforms, new enemies. Many of those same farmers sent their sons to fight across the oceans, believing once again in a flag that had nearly turned its back on them. But deep down, they never stopped measuring justice by what a man could hold in his hands: a spade, a seed, a loaf of bread. One of those sons, decades later, would walk through the ruins of an abandoned bank, just bricks and ivy now, and whisper to his grandson, "This is where we remembered who we were." The camera moves slowly through that same ruin, the light cutting through broken rafters. Outside, the fields stretch endless, golden, forgiving. The wind hums low, carrying the sound of history, part sorrow, part pride. Because what began as anger ended as a kind of rebirth. The fire that once destroyed became a boundary, a warning that justice, like the land, can only be pushed so far before it burns back. And as the sun dips over the prairie, the narrator's voice lowers, calm, reflective, final. They called them criminals, but if hunger is a crime, then justice burns slow. The camera lingers on the horizon. Where a bank once stood, wheat now sways, tall, gold, and alive. A faint wind scatters ash into the air, and for a moment it looks like snow. Sometimes the voice concludes, "A nation must burn its paper to remember its people." The screen fades to black. The land breathes again, and history once more goes silent.